Okay, hello everyone. This is BALEAP, TAFSIG and EAP for Social Justice SIG interview with Dr. Jan McArthur, who kindly agreed to talk about assessment for social justice with us. So if we just say hello to Jan first, I'll display the info here. Okay, that's it. Okay, so hello Jan, thank you for agreeing to be with us today.
Hello, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Could you very quickly just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you are currently up to, before we start the questions?
Okay, as you can see, I work at Lancaster University. I've got a number of areas of research on the go. I'm continuing to develop this idea of assessment for social justice. I've recently been applying it to a large empirical research project I'm part of, following chemistry and chemical engineering students across 3 countries and over several years. So that's been very interesting. And I'm also continuing my theoretical work on critical theory. And most recently, I published something on how we understand critical theory in a decolonial age.
That sounds absolutely marvelous. Thank you ever so much. Okay, fantastic. Let's move on to the questions then. So we've got 4. The first one is, why assessment for social justice in the first place, Jan?
Okay, so the idea on one level was quite a simple premise, that I'd become convinced by the literature on assessment for learning and on the powerful role of assessment in how and what and why students learn. I've had a long-standing commitment to social justice, and it just sort of seemed obvious to me, if assessment has such a powerful role, and if we're committed to social justice within and through higher education, then we were really overlooking the importance of putting those two together, and that the assessment literature tended to only consider justice in the sense of fairness and often fair procedure. And social justice or critical pedagogy literature, at the time I began working in this area, often avoided assessment because it's too hard to change, it's the important bit, we can't fiddle with it, and so forth. And it seemed to me that really we had to think about how the two come together. The other thing that I observed was that despite there being so many procedures and processes in place, supposedly to make assessment robust and valid and fair, it was a very, very limited sense, and it really doesn't translate into what is just. And one of the things, particularly in higher education, that I observe is that there's very little joy in assessment for both students and staff. We're under so many pressures and so much time. The way academics are forced to mark is absolutely lacking in any sense of joy. And yet here's the moment where we see either students' achievement, or we see the students who are indicating they need more help from us. So the point of assessment should be a joyous one. It should be pedagogically rich, and instead it's often incredibly technocratic and stressful. So I suppose here I'm taking assessment to be any evaluation of progress or achievement. And my view of social justice then that I bring to that is very much based in critical theory, and particularly of the Frankfurt School, and particularly the idea of the interconnection between individual and social well-being. So for a student to fulfill their own individual well-being, they need a sense of achievement of how they've learned to do something that they can help to promote greater social justice. So we need to give them these opportunities. It's what Axel Honneth calls esteem recognition, recognition that you have a contribution to make to society. And that's important for our students' own individual well-being as well. So they're the sort of theoretical ideas that I've brought together. So I think that's my answer to this question.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. It's fascinating, really. I think for me, it's not very often that we hear the word joy, in academia. So thank you very much for bringing this up and and telling us about this from your perspective. Lovely, fantastic. Let's move on to the second question, which is a little bit more focused on your on one of your books. So your book, this one here, explores assessment for social justice in two ways: the justice of assessment within higher education and assessment that promotes greater social justice. What would you say is the key to the justice of assessment?
Okay, so those two elements that you mentioned, my argument is that they're interconnected. And it's a very simple premise again, that we cannot achieve just outcomes through unjust means. So if we're looking to create the civic-minded, socially just professionals of tomorrow, so that being the social justice beyond higher education and into society, we can only do that through ways that are themselves just within higher education. And the sort of, as I said, the very technocratic, instrumental and stressful approaches we have, I think really don't marry, often with the lovely objectives that people have in their university mission statements and their generic attributes and all of these things, and yet we don't have an assessment system that reflects those. But in terms of the key to the justice of assessment, in the book I outline 5 ideas, five values that should shape practice, but it's not an exhaustive list. It's very much the start of a conversation. But if I go through those 5, it may give a flavour of what the book explores. So the first is trust, which is deliberately meant to be provocative in the concept of assessment. And I have some colleagues who write in this field who just say, well, how very silly of you to think that we can just trust students when it comes to assessment. But they're not thinking about, what does it mean when you remove trust? And say if we are talking about authentic assessment, educating the professionals of tomorrow, professional contexts are a lot about trust. I mean, there might be sanctions if you abuse that trust, but we have to be able to go to a doctor we can trust and a lawyer and trust the teacher in the classroom with our children. So the idea of trust and assessment is not actually as silly as some people say. And it's also important for the relationships we build. So for students, if we have institutionalized systems of distrust, which I say a lot of plagiarism software represents, then students, it distorts the student experience. They're more interested in pleasing that software than engaging with the knowledge and the writing, creatively sharing their thoughts. It's all about, well, I've got to please the software. And similarly for staff, students don't trust staff. We know that because of the student-led movement for anonymous assessment. And of course, the problem with this is that we're not addressing the basic, the underlying problem, which is the lack of trust. And to do that, this sort of instrumental solution of let's just make it anonymous, we then lose the personalization, which is also at the heart of it. So those 2 examples are why we have to address the issues of trust. The second is honesty. Honesty about how accurate we can be in our marking. If we have percentages out of 100, students rightfully think there's a difference between a 67 and a 69. And there isn't. There's just no way, in most subjects, unless it's a very numerically based, we can't make those fine distinctions. But we tie ourselves in knots trying to, and students get upset, and it sends very poor messages. And the other thing is, I think we should be honest with our students about how much time we spend on assessment. If an institution has a workload model where they say you have 10 minutes to read a 2,000-word assessment, well, put that in your publicity to tell future students, because actually it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful, the disrespect that we have in the procedures of assessing and how little time academics have, and professional services staff too. So the third one is responsibility. Students need a sense that they have some charge of their own work, that it's their work and that they can make decisions. To do that, they have to really understand the processes. And again, getting back to anonymous marking, when you talk to students about this, students don't understand how we mark. They really don't. And if they don't understand, then how can they take responsibility? So we have to work on that. My fourth theme is forgiveness. We know every learning theory I can think of tells us that we learn through doing. We learn through making a mistake and learning from that mistake. And yet we have very unforgiving assessment systems that make students feel that they've made a terrible mistake by not understanding the first time round. So we need more forgiving assessment systems, not that let students who are struggling stay in the same dilemma for year on year on year, but which just support the idea that it might take time to learn. It might take a few goes. You need formative feedback, really rich formative feedback along the way. And then my final point is responsiveness, which I now wonder whether that's the right term, but it's the term that came to me when I wrote the book. Mm-hmm. And this is a responsiveness of the assessment to what the student brings, and also a responsiveness to the world that we're living in. So for some people, it might link a little to the idea of authentic assessment, but in other work I've done and some things I've written about authentic assessment, I say it should be less about the task than about the student. An authentic assessment is one that allows a student to fulfill their own flourishing and place in the world. That's what would make it authentic. If it's authentic, if it allows them to be an authentic human being in society and developing the skills, the knowledge, the attributes that allow them to do that. So that's sort of the 5 ways of thinking which I suggest we should apply to assessment as a way of rethinking it. Right. So in answer to this question, there isn't one way, but it's a ways of thinking.
Okay, yes, but I think this is those 5 ways of thinking were obviously primarily for me, you know, to get so intrigued by your book and sort of so captivated by it, and obviously hence the idea of this interview was born after reading that. And I'm just, while listening to you, and obviously when I was reading, I was just thinking that in EAP we try to do the forgiveness at least, so there is hit and miss. There is a lot of quite a lot of formative assessment that then leads to summative assessment. So hopefully to avoid some of the things that you have mentioned already. So it looks quite hopeful that we as a field might be on the way to kind of meet those ways of thinking that you have outlined there. Possibly not all of them, but maybe some of them. Great, thank you very much. And that brings me to the next question, the third question. What are your ideas on assessment that promotes greater social justice?
So this was a really interesting question to reflect on, because I think it's both very easy and very difficult to come up with examples. And I suppose I would say the types of assessment, I would split them into 2 interrelated ideas. One is what the assessment's about, and the second is the processes and practices of the assessment. So assessment that promotes social justice should have a great clarity of purpose. It's extraordinary, given how important assessment is within higher education, that when you ask some academics, well, why are you using an exam? Well, we've always used an exam. What else could we do? Why are you using a 2,500 word essay? Well, that's just what we do in this subject, they say. And of course, both those forms of assessment might be really valid, but surely we've got a better way of explaining the purpose. And we need to reflect more on that, to have a clarity of purpose. Because if without that, we can't fully know what we're doing because we don't know why we're doing it. And then what chance do the poor students have? But I think in terms of focusing on ideas that promote social justice, one idea is clearly to bring in, to link assignments to social justice issues.
Mm-hmm.
But even that is more tricky than it sounds. So if I can share something from this research project that I mentioned, which is called Understanding Knowledge, Curriculum and Student Agency, one of the groups of students we talked to were in South Africa. And at the time, there was a terrible water shortage in part of South Africa, which, as you can imagine, is itself a social justice issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the students, they did an assignment that was based on, these were engineering students, thinking about how they could solve this water shortage problem. So that would, on the one hand, seem, well, that's an obvious way to link assessment to social justice. But what we found was that only a small number of the students made that connection. They saw that they were doing, if you like, a real world assessment, but they had neither the vocabulary, if you like, or just the space within the curriculum to think about it as a social justice issue rather than a purely technical engineering issue.
Mm-hmm.
So you see the possibilities, but the problems are sort of bigger than we thought. It's a good place to start, but I think we should be careful of any sort of quick fix to say, okay, we'll just make the assignments all about this sort of issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, which I think you asked me what I was doing next, and actually this is what I think I'd really like to do next, is to look at the idea of decolonizing assessment. Because if we accept that we've overly privileged Western ideas of knowledge, how do we then transfer that into our assessment systems?
Exactly.
And I think there's a lot of very big, tricky issues there. But the other thing I was saying about what assessment that promotes social justice is, I think, even though it sounds a bit boring, is to look at these processes and practices. So we need to have assessment feature in the very infancy of curriculum design, so that the spaces for learning through assessment are there in the curriculum. So too often it's crowded out. And so unless we think about these practicalities so that students get more chances for forgiveness and for learning, and so academics get more chance to see the engagement with student work as a positive part of their job, we'll never achieve social justice. Because it's so sad, isn't it? If you look on Twitter or talk to colleagues who have a pile of assessment, no one ever says, this is the highlight of my job. I'm sitting down with 200 scripts and I've got to have them all marked by next Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, they'll say, oh, send sympathy, send hugs, send wine and coffee and chocolates, and I'll go and I'm going to clean the bathroom or weed the garden because I can't face the marking. And that's a structural problem, because when I talk to academics, most of them do care very much about their students' achievement, but they do not have time to celebrate it. Does that's probably a little more vague an answer than you were looking for, but I suppose I am trying to say that this isn't about, oh, here's a quick technique. It's about ways of thinking.
That's exactly what we're looking for, because that's even in the question. So what are your ideas? Obviously we know that it is what you are currently thinking, and obviously your own thinking and the ways you have already developed, you are still developing other ways, or developing the ways that are already there. So it's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think this is what we need. Maybe look at it or see how complex all of this is, how big the job is, basically. And I think you are highlighting it brilliantly in here. Thank you ever so much. Okay, and that leads us to our last question, which is, again, in your opinion, what is the way forward? And here maybe especially in the English for academic purposes, EAP context. And maybe if you could give us some key takeaways for EAP practitioners.
Okay, so clearly I'm not an EAP specialist in any way, although I am working with a colleague of mine at Lancaster, Joanne Wood, who is one of our faculty learning development advisors. And I've learned an awful lot through her about the student perspective when it comes to this. It seems to me that, as you said earlier, as a community, you are well placed to both understand and champion the principles of assessment for social justice.
Yeah.
But I see the challenges that you face as much as I can as an outsider, as much about trying to defend and protect yourself against negative influences than any massive changes you need to make in your own practice. So the first is we still have a continual problem of elitism in academic writing, which I know is not promoted by EAP practitioners. It's often wrongly promoted by people who think they know what their academic writing should be, or by academics who sadly like to continue this idea of it as an elitist institution. So I had a student the other day who had somebody to help him because he had some special needs. It's not a specialist in academic writing, who made him feel really silly for writing in the first person. That he didn't understand being an academic, because an academic would never do that. Well, of course, that's utter nonsense. I write in the first person, and I encourage students to, unless they feel strongly they don't want to. But, you know, that idea that there's an elite club, I think you're part of the champions of dismantling that. But I know sometimes academics can be resistant. I think there's a real need to avoid technocratization, is that a word, of what you do. The idea that we can employ a piece of software and say, oh, it's a really good learning tool for academic writing. I know this sounds like I'm just incredibly old-fashioned, but I don't think I am. Really, what we need is just more good experts in academic writing on the ground, working positively with students, so that they're not focused on, oh, here's how you avoid plagiarism. They're focused on, here's how you creatively but fairly convey your ideas and their relationship with the ideas of others. And the idea that a piece of software can do this is just wrong. And we all know the piece of software I'm thinking of, I'm sure. I think the other thing is that there is an increasing pressure brought by a lot of these performative measures to make students happy. I mean, obviously, I don't want them to be unhappy, but the idea of higher education is not simply to make everyone happy. And with that idea of happy comes this idea, make it simple, make it easy, break everything into steps, make sure there's nothing unexpected on the road the student takes. And I just think that is so destroying of the richness of academic inquiry. And this rush for simplistic forms of clarity. Clarity is important, and yet in a lot of the work we do, knowledge is very messy. The process of writing is very messy.
Exactly.
I don't think you can give students a 10-step plan. I think you can help them navigate that messiness. So I think this is where you and your colleagues, I would hope, will be the champions. And then I suppose, to end on a positive note, it would be lovely if you could help both academics and students reconnect with the joy of creating a piece of work and having that standard as an achievement. which is what assessment should be. And as you said earlier, I mean, people previously have laughed at me when I've talked about joy and assessment. But my goodness, if we can't have joy in what our students have achieved, or even a different form of joy in thinking, gosh, this student's struggling, but I can help. I mean, that's why you want to be a teacher, isn't it? So I think if you can help make it legitimate so that people don't think, so that they don't laugh nervously when we connect joy and assessment, I think that would be a wonderful achievement. And I would like to be, you know, part of that campaign with you.
We would definitely like to be part of this, and I think hopefully, like I said before, hopefully we are well, different centers, obviously different universities, different institutions do it differently. Here at the center in Bristol, what you have just been saying, I think it sounds like what we do here in terms of tools, not rules. So when we are introducing, I don't know, theories of text, for example, for students to be able to decipher the genres that they come across in their own disciplines, different disciplines, the whole variety of those different disciplines, that we are giving them those tools where they can discover. And like you said, the knowledge is messy. I think it's time to acknowledge that and just not be scared of this messiness, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Embrace it.
Lovely. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the references and contact here. Thank you ever so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. And hopefully people who will be listening to it, watching it, would like to engage in a further discussion on this, either on Twitter or maybe, you know, on the websites in the comments. Once again, thank you ever so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.